Hello again. Nice to be here with you. Today we're going to be looking at biology, and the topic we're going to be looking at is regulation of the internal environment. I want to take your mind back to probably year 10 or SS1 scheme, where you talked about or you learned about characteristics of living things. And there was an acronym that was given in school about the characteristics of living things, and it is called Mr. Niger card. Mr. Niger card. Now, if you look at those letters, I think I stands for irritability. Now, what exactly is irritability? It is actually the ability of living organisms to respond to changes in their environment. These changes in the environment can also be called stimulus. So the ability of living organisms to respond to stimulus is called irritability. We can also define irritability as the ability of living organisms to respond to changes in their not external environment only, but we can say response to both the internal environment. Now, it is important for us to understand that the internal environment of every living organism, mostly animals, must always be at a balance or must always be kept at a constant state, okay? So in this particular topic, we're going to be looking at how the body ensures that the internal environment is always in a constant state. Now, in this first shoot of this topic on regulation of internal environment, we will be looking at some of the contents like the meaning of homeostasis. We've already discussed what regulation of internal environment is. We'll also be looking at organs involved in homeostasis. We're also going to be talking about homeostasis or osmoregulation in unicellular organisms. We're going to see what osmoregulation is all about. We are also going to be discussing the kidney. We're going to talk about the kidney as one of the organs that is actually responsible for regulation of the internal environment. Now, if you're ready, let's begin. Meaning of homeostasis. Remember, we were talking about the internal environment. The internal environment of mostly animals, or if I may say humans or mammals, include the tissue fluids, which is the blood and the cells, all right? The content of the cells and the blood, the lymph. These are the internal environment of mammals. And this internal environment must always be kept constant. Now, there are several cases due to temperature, due to the amount of solute that enters into the body, amount of water that gets into our system. Now, most of these things, both sometimes even the food, the exercises and all that, there is always a change. There is always an imbalance. Now, the regulation or homeostasis have to do with how the body regulates these changes and ensures that there is a fairly constant internal environment. Now, there are several cases. One might be sweating so profusely due to exercises, and that would have caused a lot of loss of water. Now, when there is so much loss of water, it means that probably the content of the cell will now have more concentration, which we can call hypertonic solution, or it can become a hypertonic content. And of course, once that kind of situation happens, it simply means osmosis will set in. What would have to do with the movement of water molecules from a region of lower concentration to a region of higher concentration. Now, once it happens, water will begin to leave the cell and enter into, water will begin to leave the tissue fluid or the blood and enter into the cell. And that will cause the cell to begin to swell. If it doesn't stop, the swell will lyse or will swell and what? Lyse. Now, these are several challenges the body will face over and over again. Now, there is every need for there to be a fairly constant internal environment. And not just that there is a need for a constant internal environment, there is a need to maintain it. Now, homeostasis has to do with the maintenance of a fairly constant internal environment. So by definition, what is homeostasis? Homeostasis is the maintenance of a fairly constant internal environment in an organism, and mostly it has to do with animals. An example is mammals. The next thing we're going to be looking at is homeostasis in unicellular organisms. We're going to see what are some of the things that actually takes place during homeostasis in unicellular organisms. Now, the cell content of unicellular organisms are always kept in a watery environment. Mostly when you're talking about the protozoa like amoeba, like paramecium, like euglena, and so on, they are always in a watery environment. And the cell content of these unicellular organisms is more concentrated when you compare it with their external environment, which is always watery. So it simply means that the cell content of amoeba or paramecium, which we are using as our subject matter, whenever they are in their external environment, their cell content is usually hypertonic, not hypotonic. Now, if it is hypertonic, it means that the external environment is hypotonic, that is diluted. And if you could take your mind back when we're looking at osmosis, we mentioned some of the conditions that are necessary for osmosis to occur. One of them is there must be a hypertonic solution. Number two, there must be a hypotonic solution. And finally, number three, there must be a semi-permeable membrane. And as far as I know, amoeba has a cell membrane, which is a semi-permeable membrane. So if the content of the cell of amoeba is hypertonic and the external environment is hypotonic, and then also we have a cell membrane, it simply means that the conditions for osmosis has already been met. So it means that also water molecules will begin to move from the lower concentration, which is the external environment, and begin to rush into the cell of the amoeba, which we're using as our case study. Now, of course, this will cause water to begin to rush into the cell, to the cytoplasm, not only into the cytoplasm, it will also rush into a particular organelle, which we call the contractile vacuoles. Now, the contractile vacuoles keep taking in much water. Now, to prevent the cell from swelling and bursting or lysing, the contractile vacuoles from time to time empty its content in order to maintain a water balance. So this is how unicellular organisms carry out homeostasis or osmoregulation. Now, in some books, you will see it as osmoregulation in unicellular organisms. So please also take note that the contractile vacuoles, the major function of the contractile vacuoles in most unicellular organisms is for osmoregulation. Now, what is actually osmoregulation? Osmoregulation is the maintenance of salt and water balance in an organism. Maintenance of salt and water balance. Now, in this case of the amoeba, what we're looking at is the maintenance of water balance. The maintenance of water balance. So this simply means that the contractile vacuoles is actually carrying out that process of osmoregulation. So this is osmoregulation in unicellular organisms, or you can say homeostasis in unicellular organism. As you can see on the screen there, we have osmoregulation in amoeba. Now, water enters the amoeba by osmosis and collects in the contractile vacuoles. Now, point 2 says that the contractile vacuoles swells by means of water rushing into it. And step 3 says that the contractile vacuoles burst to release the water. So you can see that the contractile vacuoles goes closer to the cell membrane, and that is where it empties its content, and it does that from time to time. And you see step 4 says that the process starts all over again. So this is how osmoregulation takes place in an amoeba. Now, the next thing for us to take a look at is organs that are involved in homeostasis. Now, there are several organs that are actually involved in homeostasis, and we're going to be looking at about 5 of them. Now, in subsequent of our videos, we're going to be sort of like looking in details on most of these organs and see how they carry out the process of osmoregulation or homeostasis, or you can say regulation of the internal environment. The first one we're looking at is the kidney. Now, we have also number 2, liver. We have the 3rd, which is skin. We have the 4th, which is the hormones. And then we have the 5th, which is the brain. So these are the organs of mostly mammals. Please take note, we're considering mammals in this case. The previous one we just talked about was about unicellular organisms. So the organs that are involved in homeostasis that we have just mentioned are for mammals. So we have the kidney, we have the liver, we have the skin, we have hormones, as well as the brain. Now, like I also told you that we're going to be picking one at a time to actually look at how these organs carry out the process of homeostasis. The first one we're going to be looking at is actually the kidney. The kidney. Now, the kidney is located at the abdomen, probably the lower part of the abdomen, where we have the kidney. The kidney is bean-shaped. Okay, on top of the kidney, we have the adrenal gland. We're going to be talking about that much in some of our videos when we'll be discussing about hormones. Okay, so the kidney is bean shaped, and on top of it we have the adrenal gland. Now the kidney in terms of color can be seen as reddish brown, and it is, like I said, located at the abdomen. You can say at the posterior end of the abdomen. Now the kidney, they occur in pairs, but it is important to note that the right kidney is actually slightly lower than the left one. If you can see also in the screen, we have the right kidney slightly lower than the left kidney. Somebody might be saying, but I'm watching at it, this is the right, this is the left. No, when you're actually interpreting any diagram in biology, the right hand of what you're seeing is actually the left, while the left is actually the right. In other words, what they are saying is that they are actually looking at the diagram as if it is them actually, they are drawing their own organs. So this is your left and this is the right. So that is how we interpret diagrams or tell the sides of diagrams in biology. Now, another important thing to note about the kidney is that the kidney, when you do a longitudinal section, that is cutting the kidney from top to bottom, you will discover 2 distinct parts. And these 2 distinct parts are called the cortex, and we have the medulla. The outer part is called the cortex, and then the inner part is called the medulla. Now, between the cortex and the medulla, there are actually fine narrow tubes or tubules which are called the urinary tubules that pass through them. All right. Now, the urinary tubules actually opens to a triangular shaped mass which is called the pyramid, and the pyramid also opens to another funnel shaped cavity which is called the pelvis, and the pelvis actually runs through to what we call the ureter, which is actually a long cord, okay, a long cord or tube that connects the kidney to the urinary bladder. Now, if you take a full look at the urinary system, you're going to appreciate more of the diagram of the kidney, how the kidney is connected to the urinary bladder. So actually the cord or duct or tube per se that connects the kidney to the bladder is called the ureter. It's called the ureter. While there is a big difference actually between the ureter and the urethra. Now, the urethra is actually urinogenital in the sense that it carries out both the function of excretion and the function of reproduction. Now, the urethra is after the urinary bladder, So it does not connect the urinary bladder to the kidney. That is the job of the ureter. All right. Now, moving ahead, we have functions of the kidney. Functions of the kidney. Now, the kidney carries out three main functions. Three main functions. In fact, I will personally say that the kidney carries out two main functions, because the first one has to do with osmoregulation. The second is actually excretion, which has to do with the removal of waste product of metabolism from the body. But the third is also a form of osmoregulation, or a form of homeostasis, and that is maintenance of acid-base balance. Maintenance of acid-base balance. So these are actually the three functions of the kidney. We're going to be looking at that very briefly, the functions of the kidney. The first one we said is osmoregulation. Now, quickly, let me define osmoregulation again. We said is the process whereby an animal regulates the balance between water and salt. There is a regulation of balance between water and salt. I told you to maintain a balance between water and salt. Now, the body does not have room for excess or shortage of water and salt. No. So the body does not have room for excess water to be stored. No. The body also does not have room for excess salt to be stored. The body also does not have room for shortage of water and as well as shortage of salt. Hence, that is why the body always tries to maintain a balance between them. And that is what osmoregulation is all about. Now, let's take a look at the osmoregulatory function of the kidney. Now, when the osmotic concentration, remember we talked about the internal environment, we said the blood is a part of the internal environment. We talked about the lymph, we said is also an example of the internal environment. Now, there I told you also that there are several cases, there are several conditions, probably by exercise, or it can even be by the food we eat. It can also be by the place we find ourselves, that the place might be the temperature might be high, or the temperature might be cold. Now, when the osmotic concentration of the blood is higher, that simply means if the content, okay, if the content, the solute that are dissolved in the blood is higher compared to the content of the cell, that's the cell content. And of course, I told you if we're talking about solutes, we're looking at mostly digested food like amino acids, we have glucose, we have minerals, etc. Now, if the concentration of the blood that is being hypertonic is higher compared to that of the content of the cell, something will happen. Now, the kidney, instead of osmosis to actually take place, the kidney will help to extract some of those solutes, which is the amino acid, the glucose and all that, will extract them from the blood and then absorb more water with the help of a hormone, which is called the antidiuretic hormone. For short, you can call it ADH. Now, ADH is actually produced by the pituitary gland. Please don't forget this. We're going to be talking about more in some of our videos. You're going to see a talk on hormones, where we're going to be discussing about the pituitary gland. We're also going to come back to this ADH, okay? So please take note, when the osmotic concentration of the blood is high, that is the content in the blood or the solute content of the blood is higher than the content in the cell, the kidney will extract most of those contents or the solutes from the blood and then absorb more water. Now, once it does that, it is trying to create a balance. It's trying to maintain or create a balance and maintain it. Now, also, when the osmotic concentration of the blood becomes low, the kidney extracts more water than usual. Okay, that simply means that even the ADH is not much. All right, it's not much. Like now, in the first instance, where we say that the ADH helps the kidney to extract more water, to absorb more water from the blood, this makes the urine concentration to be very high. the concentration of the urine will be high, and then the volume of urine that is being passed out will also be what? Low. Now, have you ever, in some cases, when you go to the toilet to actually pass out urine, you discover that the volume of urine you pass out is small, and then also, apart from the volume that is small that you passed out, you discover that the urine is concentrated, very colored, okay? Now, that simply means that your blood or your kidney has actually absorbed so much water, because in your blood, in the content of your blood, the osmotic concentration is what? High. So the kidney is trying to maintain a balance, all right? So this is how the kidney carries out osmoregulation, all right? Now, the second one we mentioned was excretory functions of the kidney. We said that the kidney carries out excretion. Now, if you go through our videos under excretion, you're going to discover that we have three levels or three phases of excretion, mostly as it deals with urine formation, how urine is actually formed. Of course, that you should understand that the kidney actually excretes a metabolic product or waste, which is called urine. It's called urine. So the kidney removes it. It forms it first and then removes it. And the formation of urine occurs in the urinary tubules. Now, there are three stages, like I said before. Now, these three stages include: one, we have the ultrafiltration. Number two, we have selective reabsorption. Number three, we have what we call hormonal secretion. Now, these are the three things that actually takes place. Now, that's the urinary tubule. You can see those red tapes there on the screen. You see this. This part is what we call the Bowman's capsule. Okay, that's the Bowman's capsule. Now, this content inside of the Bowman's capsule is what we call the glomerulus. Okay, then after the Bowman's capsule, you can see the proceeding, the tubules. They are convoluted here, that is entwined. We call this proximal convoluted tubules. Now, you can see this one that is like a loop. They call this the Henle's loop. And then when you move up again, you have the distal convoluted tubules. Now, all through, as the blood passes through these stages, it carries out the formation of urine. It's inside of the kidney. These tubules is inside of the kidney. Now, let's take a look at what happens during ultrafiltration. Now, during ultrafiltration, as the name implies, it involves the filtering of materials from the glomerulus into the Bowman's capsule. Filtering of materials from the glomerulus into the Bowman's capsule. Now, the glomerulus, like I said before, is just a mass of blood that contains everything. It contains digested food, it contains nutrients, it contains excretory waste and products. Everything, in fact, all make up the glomerulus. Now, of course, you know what filtration is. Filtration is actually a process of separating separating an insoluble solid from a liquid. So that is actually what takes place. Now, the useful materials return back to the blood, while the filtrate, which is actually the excretory products, pass into the proximal convoluted tubules. That is after filtration. So after ultrafiltration, the next process that takes place is selective reabsorption. Now, during selective reabsorption, the blood passes through, or the filtrate passes through the proximal convoluted tubules and the Henle's loop. Now, when it passes through these places, there is also a reabsorption of useful materials that may have passed through the Bowman's capsule and entered as part of the filtrate in through the proximal convoluted tubules, and the Henle's loop are reabsorbed back into the blood capillaries. Then it now proceeds from the Henle's loop. It now moves to the third stage, which is hormonal secretion. Remember, we've talked about ADH. This is where it actually occurs. Now, it occurs at the distal convoluted tubules where more water is reabsorbed by the help and action of ADH. Okay, now as ADH comes into the game, it helps the kidney to reabsorb more water. Now, this leaves the urine to be few in volume, but very concentrated. I repeat again, the ADH is produced by the pituitary gland. So these are the three main stages during urine formation. Now, number 3 function of the kidney. The kidney helps to maintain acid-base balance. Remember, I said that this is also part of homeostasis. So it helps to maintain acid-base balance. Now, when the body fluid becomes more acidic, more acid is excreted by the kidney with urine. And also when the concentration of base becomes higher, more salt will be excreted with the urine. Have you ever considered probably tasting your urine if you can? And if you have, you will discover that there are sometimes your urine tastes more salty. Now, why does it taste more salty? It is actually because the body fluid, the concentration of base in the body fluid is actually high. So the kidney tries to maintain a balance by excreting more salt out with the urine. So that is why the urine tastes actually so salty. So these are actually the 3 main functions of the kidney. Number 1 is osmoregulation, number 2 is excretion, and number 3 is maintenance of acid-base balance. Now, moving ahead, let's look at conditions that affects the functioning of the kidney. Now, the kidney can be affected in several ways. In fact, the functioning of the kidney can be affected. We've seen several cases where people have several kidney failure in terms of functionings and so on. Now, there are several things that can cause kidney failure. Now, let's take a look at that can affect the functioning of the kidney. Now, let's take a look at the first one. The first one is environmental temperature. Number 2 is drugs, okay? Number 2 is drugs, and number 3 is habitat. And the fourth one is what we call diseases. Now, I'm going to actually stress a little on diseases because that is one of the major cause of conditions that is actually affecting the kidney. Now, let's take a look at the first one we're going to be considering today, probably about 4 of them. The first one is called kidney nephritis. Now, kidney nephritis is actually a condition in which the blood vessels in the Bowman's capsule is inflamed. Now, when you say something is actually inflamed, it simply means it is infected by microorganisms or with microorganisms. Now, it is also inflamed and it becomes porous. Now, if you look at the structure we have there on the screen, you will discover, you can see the structure of the normal kidney, and then you can see the structure of an inflamed kidney. All right. Now, what causes this inflammation? Like I said, it is caused mostly by infections. Now, it is caused by bacterial infection. Now, let's take a look at some of the effects of kidney nephritis. We've seen that kidney nephritis is actually an inflamed, or is actually caused by bacterial infection, which brings about an inflammation or porousness in the kidney. Now, one of the effects of kidney nephritis is actually the presence of nutrients in urine. Now, when we're talking about nutrients, we're actually looking at amino acid being present in urine. We're actually looking at glucose being present in urine and all these other nutrients, the fatty acids, glycerol being present in urine. Now, once you diagnose that nutrients are actually present in urine, that is not a good call. So it is either that the person has kidney nephritis, Okay, it's harder kidney nephritis. Now, the reason for actually having nutrients in the urine is because of the porousness of the Bowman's capsule due to the inflammation. Okay, so useful materials or essential materials that are supposed to be transported by the blood back to other parts of the body actually, due to the porousness, enter into the tubules and then also pass through. When urine is formed, they become part of the urine that is actually formed. Now, another effect of kidney nephritis is weakness of the body. It brings about weakness of the body. Number 3, it also brings about fever and pains. Now, how do we remedy this situation? One of the best ways to do that is kidney transplant. Now, kidney transplant, of course, is not easy. You need to get a donor, and it's very expensive, and so on. Another way, again, to actually help out is use of dialysis. Now, dialysis has to do with the technique actually involved in carrying out artificial kidney or implanting an artificial kidney. All right. Now, it's quite different from kidney transplant. Now, kidney transplant is actually using another person's own kidney and implanting it on a person that is actually the kidney is infected. All right. Then, in terms of dialysis, it is the technique, it is the procedure. It has to do with the practice of giving a person an artificial kidney. And then another way we can also combat the inflammation or the infection by the bacteria is the use of antibiotics. Now, this use of antibiotics should be strictly based on the doctor's recommendation, not self-medication, okay? Thank you. Now, the next one we're going to be looking at is kidney stone. Now, kidney stone is also another important kidney disease that affects the functioning of the kidney. Now, kidney stone is actually caused by some diseased growth within the tubules. As you can see there on the screen, you can see growth that looks like stones that are actually blocking the tubules of the kidney. And these disease growth may narrow urine passage. Of course, you can see that's the kidney. Now, the pelvis is actually leading into the ureter. Now, you can also see that we have the stone here, okay? So once urine is formed here and the urine passes through, it will be obstructed, or it can reduce the flow of urine. And this thing poses a very big challenge. Let's take a look at some of the effects. Number 1 effect is that it obstructs the passage of urine, which we have discovered. And number 2, it causes severe abdominal pain. Severe abdominal pain. And then when passing out urine. And then number 3, it leads to high blood pressure. It leads to fever. It leads to chills and blood in the urine. Probably the person wants to force out the urine, and the person gets injured in the process. This can cause blood in the urine. Another one again is, let's look at ways we can remedy a situation that has kidney stone. One of the ways to remedy this situation is surgery. Surgery can be advised. Now, surgery in this case is called nephrectomy. It's called nephrectomy. Another way we can also remedy this situation is taking a lot of water. So drink a lot of water. Another one is to reduce your intake of proteins. Reduce your intake of proteins. Okay, let's look at the third disease, which is called diuresis, kidney diuresis. Now, diuresis is actually a condition in which the cells of the kidney tubules are not reabsorbing water from the glomerular filtrate. Now, this results in large amount of water passed out in urine. It also occurs in patients suffering from diabetes. All right, so that's diuresis. Now, what are the effects of diuresis? Now, some of the effects of diuresis is that it leads to excretion of large amount of water in urine. It also leads to the loss of weight and emaciation. because the person is actually passing out a lot of water. Of course, we said that the body weight is more of water. It's more determined by the amount of water we have in us. So it leads to the loss of weight, and it can also bring about emaciation, and also it can bring about high thirst for water. Now, once again, what is the way forward? Surgical operations on patients, it should be performed by an experienced or specialized doctor. Another way you can combat diuresis is the use of drugs to get rid of excess water in the body. And I've told you, use of drugs should be based on the doctor's prescription, not based on self-medication. Now, the last one we're going to be looking at today is called dropsy or oedema. Dropsy or oedema. Now, this is a condition in which the cells of the Bowman's capsule are unable to absorb water from the blood in the tubes. Now, when the Bowman's capsule is unable to absorb water from the blood, it leads to blood accumulating in several areas like the face, like the ankles, as you can see on the screen, like the ankles. These are the results that are actually going to take place when a person has oedema or dropsy. Now, what are some of the effects? We've mentioned one of them. It leads to the swelling in the face and ankles. Number 2, it causes sluggishness. Number 3, it leads to abdominal pain. And then number 4, it leads to constant weakness or fatigue. Now, what is the remedy to this problem? There should be reduction in water intake, and kidney transplant can also be recommended as when it is critical. So this is where we're going to call it a wrap-up. We've just been looking at homeostasis, the meaning of homeostasis. We've also talked about organs that are responsible for maintaining a fairly constant internal environment. And we've started with the first one, which is the kidney. Watch out for the next video for more exciting teachings on this particular topic on regulation of internal environment. Now, before I go, I would just want us to take a look at 1 or 2 questions using the ExamGuide app. Let's look at the ExamGuide app. We're going to pick a particular question, probably one. Let's see, 1 or 2. Okay. We move to this. All right. Take a look at this question. An example of homeostasis in living organisms is, cooling effect resulting from evaporation of water from the body surface. I think that's the correct answer, but we're going to be discussing that much more later when we start talking about the skin as an organ of homeostasis. Then let's pick another important question. Okay, look at this question. They said the ability of organisms to maintain a constant internal environment is known as, the correct answer is D, homeostasis. Look at number 6 again. The question brought back again, but actually refined or remodified. The process of maintaining a steady internal environment is known as the same homeostasis. Okay. Then we have the maintenance of a constant internal environment, the same homeostasis. Are you seeing that 3 times these questions have been popping out over and over again? That's why it's important you go through past questions always to prepare yourselves for exams, for any external exam. And this is where we're going to call it a wrap-up for now on this particular class. I'm going to see you in our next video. Bye for now.